What would you do, if someone slapped you across the face in first class? And everyone around you, just looked away? She was a military officer. She had fought in Afghanistan. But the hardest blow came from a flight attendant on a domestic flight within the United States. The flight from Atlanta to Denver was supposed to be just over 3 hours. To many, it was a short journey, a break between two meetings, or simply a trip to visit loved ones. But for Major Lisa Reynolds, the first-class cabin on that flight was no place for rest. It became the place where she had to prove, once again, that a title, a rank, and 22 years of service still weren't enough to earn respect. Just because she was a woman of color. If you've ever been coldly dismissed, ever received suspicious glances because of how you look, or stayed silent in the face of injustice just to avoid trouble, then today's story will resonate with you. In this video, you will witness a slap that didn't just redden a cheek, but forced a whole system to land. Three people, from three generations, forming an unexpected alliance in the sky. And a speech that made millions of Americans pause and ask, how are we treating one another? This wasn't just a controversial incident. It was a living lesson, about silence, about dignity. And about how one person can change everything, with a single phone call. Let us begin with the moment that silenced the entire cabin. It started with a very small sound. Not the roar of jet engines. Not the clatter of luggage falling from overhead bins. But the sound of skin hitting skin. In a moment so utterly wrong. A slap at 35,000 feet. A black female officer, in full military uniform, a woman who had once commanded in war-torn Afghanistan, was slapped by a flight attendant in the middle of first class. For a split second, the cabin fell into a thick, tangible silence. The kind of silence that needs no signal, yet everyone understands. Something just happened. And no one dares to look it in the eye. 3 rows back, a teenager pulled out his phone. His hand trembling, but still able to record the scene. Across the aisle, an elderly woman clutched the cross on her necklace. And at the center, Major Lisa Reynolds sat upright, as if still in formation. Though the red spreading across her cheek wasn't just from the slap, but from the layered prejudice she'd carried her whole life. It didn't begin with the slap. It started with the suspicious glance when she entered first class. With the sugar-coated sarcasm in the attendant's voice when asking if she was in the wrong seat. With how she was served last, then accidentally had sauce spilled on her uniform. The slap was just the final drop. But sadly, it was only when the glass shattered that people began to notice. And that's the troubling part. In today's society, we are far too quick to overlook the small things. A look, a tone, a slight. We wait for an action to be too obvious, too blatant, before we react. But injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it only whispers. Subtle enough to be rationalized. Thin enough to avoid being caught. Until it accumulates into a slap. Not just across the victim's face, but across the silence of an entire society. Because justice doesn't always begin in a courtroom. It starts with the eyes that dare to see. With the hands that dare to record. With the people who dare to speak up. Even when they're unsure what the consequences will be. And in that seemingly breaking moment, amidst a cabin thick with bias, with both air pressure and social pressure building, something else began to form. An alliance. A resistance. A phone call that shook the entire system. Because this woman was not just a victim. She was a living symbol of what America still struggles to achieve. Liberty. Equality. And the courage to reclaim it when it is denied. What shaped the steel calm in her eyes after being slapped in front of dozens of people? And how could just one phone call lead to an emergency landing of the entire plane? To understand why that slap didn't make her scream, didn't make her lose control. We need to go back to the beginning. To the woman sitting in seat 3A. Who was she? She grew up in the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, where both of her parents were high school teachers. Every morning, her mother left a note on the breakfast table. Make them see you, even when they try not to. They didn't teach her how to fight. They taught her how to survive in rooms where no one wanted her present. And Lisa carried that spirit every step of the way. She graduated from West Point, the most prestigious military academy in the United States. She became the first black female officer to command a logistics unit in Kandahar. She coordinated thousands of tons of military supplies, ensuring frontline soldiers had what they needed to survive. She didn't win any major medals. She didn't make the news for heroic achievements. But everyone who served on the battlefield remembered her as the one who was always there when it mattered. In midnight meetings echoing with distant gunfire. On sand-covered airstrips where helicopters just landed. In command rooms filled with red-marked maps. Lisa was always there. And throughout those 22 years, she learned how to endure. When she was mistaken for a nurse during her first briefing with senior commanders. When she had to give orders to soldiers who refused to make eye contact with her, just because she was a woman. When a male colleague joked that she got promoted thanks to diversity art. Lisa stayed silent. She worked. She moved forward. Because for her, simply existing in those roles was already an act of defiance. There was a time, while stationed in Iraq, when she got word that her younger sister had just given birth. She only got to see the baby's photo via satellite phone. During a short break before dispatching a convoy through a dangerous region, a comrade asked, "Do you ever regret choosing this path?" She smiled. "No. Because if I don't walk this road, who will clear it for those who come next?" That's Lisa Reynolds, not just an officer, but a carrier of a quiet legacy. A legacy of black women in uniform, who broke through barriers, who paved the way with endurance, not microphones or banners. And perhaps that's why the slap didn't shake her. Because she was used to invisible slaps, every day, for years. The difference this time was, people finally saw it. But there was still something Karen, the flight attendant, didn't know. The woman she had just humiliated had direct access to a Pentagon general. And a single phone call from Lisa could bring that plane, and the whole system, to the ground. Maybe the years of harsh training and life-threatening missions taught her how to stay calm. But nothing could prepare her for the blows that come from disdain. The kind that don't make noise, but cut deep. And that flight was full of such blows. Sometimes, what hurts the most isn't what someone says to your face, but how they say it. Are you sure this is the right seat for your ticket? Oh, is this your first time flying first class? If you'd like, I can show you how to use the seat controls. None of it was overtly rude. There were no raised voices. No one laid a hand on her. And that's exactly what made it so dangerous. The attendant named Karen never shouted. She smiled, but only when serving other passengers. She said thank you for flying Delta, but her tone dropped 10 degrees colder when it was Lisa. She spilled the sauce, but only on the one person in uniform. This is what we call microaggressions. Acts of discrimination so subtle they're easy to overlook, but repeated like needles that pierce over and over again, forcing the target to carry the burden quietly. Microaggressions don't scream "you're not welcome." They whisper. And because they're not loud enough, outsiders don't hear them. But those who experience them, never forget. Most people who face discrimination don't speak up about microaggressions. They fear being called too sensitive, paranoid, imagining things. Lisa used to be that way, too. Throughout her career, she learned to look past them, to focus on what mattered more. She used to think, If I react, they'll say I'm unprofessional. But if I stay silent, who will speak up? The incident on the flight wasn't Lisa's first encounter with Karen. Because Karen isn't a name. It's a symbol of a certain type of small but familiar power. The power of those who believe they get to define who belongs where. In this case, Karen believed Lisa didn't belong in first class. Not because of her actions. Not because of any fault. Just because. Lisa didn't look like a typical first-class passenger. But Karen was wrong, not only in her actions. She misjudged who she was dealing with. Because modern-day discrimination rarely looks like it used to. It's no longer brutal and raw. It's become subtle, smiling, and all the more difficult to confront. But no matter the form it takes, staying silent in the face of quiet contempt is how it grows stronger. Lisa understood that. So this time, she didn't look away. She didn't switch seats. She didn't bow her head. She didn't brush it off like she always had. She quietly pulled out her phone. And called a name. Powerful enough to make not just a plane, but a system, stop in its tracks. So who were the people who witnessed it all? How did they respond? And how did three strangers, seated in a first-class cabin, form an unlikely alliance? Lisa had grown used to being brushed off. To hearing dismissive words as light as air. But this time, she wasn't alone. In that cabin, there were two others, seemingly unrelated. Who would unintentionally become her most important allies in this silent battle. No one boarded that plane expecting to be a witness. They were just ordinary passengers. One on a business trip. Another visiting family. Some just traveling through another ordinary day. But when the slap rang out, every eye turned toward seat 3A. And right there, three people, from three different generations, became something rare. A cross-section of America. First, there was Tyler Chen. 16 years old. Asian American. Wore headphones nearly the entire flight. For him, the world existed within his phone. Until he looked up and saw injustice unfold right in front of him. Tyler represented a generation raised in the age of social media. Where justice isn't just a courtroom verdict, but also a video posted at the right moment. He didn't just record what happened. He spoke up. Even as the adults around him hesitated. Next came Margaret Wilson. 73 years old. White. Wore a floral dress and a rosary around her neck. She didn't immediately defend Lisa. She didn't confront Karen. She just sat there, quietly observing, like so many who have witnessed injustice but didn't know how to respond. But when Tyler spoke up, and when Lisa stayed composed despite the mistreatment, something shifted inside her. She handed over a pack of tissues. Then offered a pen to help remove the stain. Then added her voice when the flight attendant returned. Trying to assert misplaced authority. It wasn't guilt. It was a moment of awakening. And in between them was Lisa. No longer suffering alone. No longer the solitary figure in a cabin full of bias. For the first time on that flight, she felt the presence of allies. Not allies in uniform, but in principle. In integrity. In the shared desire not to let wrongness go unanswered. That image. A black woman. An Asian American teenager. A white elderly woman. Sitting side by side. Listening to one another. Protecting one another. Amidst a cabin thick with pressure. Was the most beautiful image of America we've ever hoped for. Not perfect. Not identical. But united when it matters most. Because change doesn't always need protests, slogans, or megaphones. Sometimes, all it takes is three people, from three generations. Choosing to stand on the side of what's right. One who records. One who speaks up. One who dares to change old beliefs. And when those three looked toward Lisa. When Tyler handed her tissues. When Margaret reached out and held her hand. And when Lisa smiled for the first time since boarding the plane. We understood. She was no longer alone. And this story was no longer just hers. But the battle didn't end there. When the truth starts to surface, the system, long accustomed to burying it, will react. And power will begin to shift. In ways no one expected. 3 generations. 3 seats. 3 people. One moment powerful enough to bind them together. And then, mid-air, power began to shift. No longer in the hands of those who give orders, but in the hands of those who stand firm in what's right. On any flight, flight attendants hold the practical authority in the cabin. They're trained to control passengers, maintain order, and manage emergencies. And most of the time, passengers, regardless of status, defer to them. Because on board, they have the final say. But there was one thing Karen Davis, the flight attendant that day, didn't anticipate. She was facing a senior officer in the United States military. Lisa didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam the tray table. She didn't demand compensation. She quietly took out her phone, opened her contact list, and selected a name few would dare to call. General Marcus Phillips. Just one simple action. And power in that cabin began to shift. Karen, who had controlled the cabin with forced smiles and soft commands, began to lose her grip. Not because Lisa shouted, but because of her unshakable calm and razor-sharp clarity. Lisa didn't argue. She simply said, "I'm a commanding officer in the military. And this is a security issue, not a personal one." With just that sentence, the entire dynamic in the cabin flipped. In a space where people are usually judged by appearances, by outfits, by seat numbers, true honor wasn't in the uniform, but in how she used it. Lisa didn't use her rank to force compliance. She used her values to uphold the right principles. Not for her own pride, but for the safety and justice of all. In truth, the greatest strength Lisa showed wasn't in her authority, but in not being afraid to lose it. She wasn't hesitant to mention her superiors. She wasn't afraid of being recorded. She didn't shy away from becoming the center of attention, even though all she wanted was a peaceful flight like everyone else. This story forces us to reflect. When does a role stop being enough to shield wrongdoing? And when should power be used? Not to dominate, but to clarify the line between right and wrong? Karen thought she was the cabin in charge. But in the end, the one who truly controlled the situation was the person who had stayed silent the longest. The one who spoke only when there was enough proof, enough witnesses, and enough weight in every word. And that was when true power revealed itself. No need for yelling. No need for threats. Just a person standing tall, with unwavering integrity. When the video was recorded, when the story began to spread across social media, when the public became the jury, a slap at 35,000 feet became headline news on the ground. Karen lost control. Not because she was yelled at, but because for the first time, she faced someone who wasn't afraid of her silence. But power in that cabin wasn't just changing hands. It was being documented, frame by frame, for the world to see. When Tyler Chen was younger, he used to believe that justice was something only adults decided. The police, the judges, those with the power to pass verdicts. But on that day, in seat 3C, Tyler realized, justice, sometimes, begins with pressing record. When flight attendant Karen slapped Major Reynolds, Tyler caught the entire incident on video. Not because he wanted to go viral. Not because he knew exactly what he was doing. Simply because He didn't want the truth to be denied. Everyone on the plane saw it. But not everyone would remember the details. Stress blurs the line between emotion and logic. Karen could say, "I tripped." Some might doubt, maybe she didn't mean it. But the camera doesn't forget. The footage doesn't shake with emotion. And that clip, less than 30 seconds long, became the most powerful fourth witness. Just minutes later, Tyler sent the clip to a friend. Then someone posted it on TikTok. Then came a hashtag. Hashtag respect their service. Hashtag Flight 1380 incident. And as with every story that touches a deep societal wound, it caught fire. 300,000 views in 1 hour. 2 million shares in 12. The entire country started talking. About the slap. About race. About justice. And about how we treat each other in public spaces. If that video hadn't existed, would anyone believe a black woman who said she was slapped in first class? Would the story have been reworded to sound more palatable? Would an apology have ever been issued? The truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be seen, and not erased. In the digital age, each of us is a witness. The phone in your hand isn't just for entertainment. It can be a shield. A record. A tool to prevent a wrong from being forgotten. Not everyone who records a clip wants to be an activist. But thanks to them, so many stories, once smothered in silence, have been lit up again. George Floyd. Asian hate attacks. And now, Major Lisa Reynolds. And as all of America started replaying that video, as headlines appeared on every news outlet and phone screen, as even the airline CEO was forced to issue a statement, Lisa understood. This time, justice wouldn't be decided behind closed doors. It was happening out there, among the millions watching. The clip had gone viral. The truth had been shared. And this time, justice didn't wait for a courtroom. But if the truth was so easily brought to light, if a single slap could jolt an entire society, then we must ask, was Karen Davis really the root cause? Or, was she just a symptom? Karen's behavior, the scrutinizing glances, the condescending tone, the final slap, didn't come from nowhere. It grew in an environment where such actions had happened before. And no one was held accountable. When Lisa called her commanding general, and when the video spread like wildfire, the airline rushed to release a statement, issued an apology, and announced Karen's termination. But ask yourself, what if Lisa hadn't worn that uniform? What if Tyler hadn't recorded the video? What if Lisa were just an ordinary black woman, unknown, unconnected? Would the airline have acted as swiftly? Or would it have been an internal investigation? A quiet report concluding insufficient evidence to determine wrongdoing. This is the deeper root we must confront. The culture of impunity. A culture that allows discrimination, abuse of power, and prejudice to persist. Because no one is fully held accountable. Because the system is designed to protect those at fault. As long as they follow procedure. Pushpin: a flight attendant previously accused of racial bias, promoted. Pushpin: a security officer who pushed a disabled passenger, given a verbal warning. Pushpin: a passenger who called an Asian American a walking virus. Invited onto another flight, unpunished. These stories aren't rare. What's rare, is the victim having enough weight to make it news. It's easy to say, we don't discriminate. But declarations are not enough. What matters is the response when discrimination does happen. A good system isn't one without flaws. It's one that takes responsibility, corrects mistakes, and doesn't repeat them. After the incident, the airline was forced to review its entire training protocol. They began implementing courses on unconscious bias. Added new policies to protect uniformed service members on flights. and opened a hotline for employees to report discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. These were small steps, but the beginning of treating the disease at its root. Because the slap was just a symptom. The root cause lay in a culture of silence and privilege. But there's an even more painful assumption we must examine. What if Lisa wasn't a soldier? We've heard much about Major Lisa Reynolds, the strong, resilient officer who stood her ground in a plane cabin. She became the ideal. A black woman rising above adversity, honored for her service and character. But now, imagine the entire story again. If Lisa hadn't been in uniform, no military rank, no Pentagon contacts, no media coverage, just a black woman sitting in seat 3A. Would the outcome have been the same? In reality, there are thousands of other Lisas who've endured discrimination, humiliation, and dismissal. But never got a platform. Never had anyone speak for them. And certainly had no institutional weight behind them. Pushpin, a black hotel employee accused of theft, just for stepping into an elevator with a white guest. Pushpin, a black mother kicked out of a mall, suspected of not having enough money. Pushpin, an Asian girl told. This is America, not your village market. No video. No headlines. No hashtag. And the story fades. As if it never happened. The truth is, reputation, status, or a uniform. These are invisible shields that make people more believable. More quickly defended. More clearly apologized to. And when respect becomes something you have to prove, with documents, titles, or rank, equality has already gone astray. Lisa understood that. She had once been a young soldier with no authority. Once called logistics girl. Once asked to verify her ID even inside a military base. She knew the feeling of having to work twice as hard just to be seen as qualified enough. The lesson here isn't just for the marginalized. It's for all of us. Especially those of us who carry privilege without even realizing it. Maybe you've never been refused service. Never been questioned walking into a luxury space. Never had to prove you're worthy of respect. That is privilege. And privilege isn't inherently wrong. Only when we fail to recognize it, does our silence become complicity. That's why Lisa's action wasn't just for herself. She used her position to create a precedent. So those without power can be protected in the future. She didn't stand up for military honor. She stood up for those who will never have the chance she had. Those without a uniform. Without media coverage. Without hundreds of thousands watching their videos. And that's when the story outgrew the airplane cabin. It entered society, the law, and policy making. The question was no longer, was she right? But, what will we do to make sure no one else goes through this, no matter who they are? She knew not everyone is lucky enough to be heard. So this time, she chose not to stay silent. She stood up. And used her voice. Not to boast about her service. But to return a voice. To those who've been forced into silence. As the plane began its descent, preparing to land in Denver. The cabin was still buzzing. Some whispered. Some stayed silent. A few secretly replayed the video on their phones. The slap was over. But its aftermath still hung in the air. Like cabin pressure waiting to be released. And then, Lisa Reynolds stood up. She was not a politician. Not a professional speaker. She held no paper in her hands. But she asked for permission to speak. Right there, in the airplane cabin, with the small microphone mounted near the flight attendant's station. She spoke, slowly, clearly, to every passenger, including those who had remained silent. I am Major Lisa Reynolds of the United States Army. I'm not standing here out of personal pride. I'm standing here, because I believe you deserve to know what just happened. She spoke of the discrimination. Not just the slap, but the series of behaviors leading up to it. She spoke of her years of service to the country, the missions she had led. But what silenced the cabin was not her achievements. It was this one sentence. I used to believe that silence was the best way to keep the peace. But today, I understand. There are times when silence becomes a form of complicity in injustice. The air in the cabin shifted. A man placed his hand over his heart. A woman quietly wiped away tears. Tyler gripped his phone tightly, as if guarding every word she spoke. And in seat 14F, Margaret Wilson softly whispered, "Amen." In that moment, Lisa was no longer just a passenger. She became the voice for everyone who had ever been hurt. And had no one to stand up for them. No justifications. No pleas for pity. Just a woman. In uniform. Demanding the most basic of human dignities, respect. Pushpin, and from that moment on, her story no longer belonged to her alone. It was shared. Passed on. Etched into people's hearts. It became a spark that ignited thousands of others to share their own stories. Those who were kicked out of stores. Those who were called slurs. Those who were ignored in hospitals, classrooms, offices. The lesson here isn't just, speak up. It's, when you speak up at the right moment, you don't just save yourself. You may open the door for so many others. Not everyone holds a microphone. But everyone can speak a truth. So that silence doesn't win again. And when Lisa ended her speech with a simple thank you, the entire cabin applauded. Not because she was a soldier, but because she had awakened something in all of them. A truth they had always known, but never said out loud. And then, the plane landed. But the story didn't stop. It spread beyond the Denver airport. Into boardrooms. Onto headlines. Into policy reform campaigns. It touched the heart of America. Not through outrage, but through a quiet courage that refused to stay silent. That speech was never broadcast. There was no stage. No script. But it reached into people's hearts like a wordless manifesto. And then, the plane landed. But the story continued, no longer in the hands of one woman, but in the hands of all of us. The flight finally touched down. The wheels hit the runway. The engines hummed quietly. People gathered their belongings, stood up, straightened jackets, phones lit up. A regular flight, ending like any other. But for Major Lisa Reynolds, the fight had only just begun. She stepped off the plane, still in the same stained uniform, but standing as tall as she had when walking into a combat zone years before. Outside, the media was already waiting. The Pentagon had spoken. Delta Airlines had issued a statement. And America began having a deeper conversation about the right to be respected. From one personal act, a slap at 35,000 feet, the story quickly became a symbol of much greater issues. Pushpin: how systems treat those without power. Pushpin: the invisible layers of privilege that some possess, but rarely recognize. Pushpin: and most of all, how prolonged silence can make what is wrong feel normal. After the incident, Lisa didn't stop with her speech. She began working with organizations that protect passenger rights. She accepted invitations to speak at military academies, where she told cadets, "Honor isn't found in your rank. It's in what you choose to do when no one expects anything from you." She received thousands of messages from people who had been insulted, ignored, or silenced. They didn't know how to push back. But thanks to her, they realized, I am not alone. Because in truth, we are all on the same flight, called life. And on that flight, there will always be moments when someone is treated unfairly. Someone must decide whether to speak up. And one person, just one, can change how an entire cabin responds. with a single act of decency. You don't have to be a soldier to protect what's right. You don't need hundreds of thousands of followers to make an impact. You just need a heart that stays awake, eyes that dare to look injustice in the face, and a voice, even a small one, spoken at the right time. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not look away, not ignore, not pretend you didn't see. Lisa did that at 35,000 feet. But you can do it right here, on the ground. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest legacy she leaves behind. Not medals, but inspiration. For ordinary people to rise. In the moments when no one demands it of them. So the final question is not for Lisa. It's for all of us. On this flight called life. When your moment comes, will you stay silent? Or will you be the one who stands up? Thank you for joining us on this journey. A story that began with a slap, but ended with millions of eyes turning toward what's right. Not everyone can change the entire system. But everyone can choose not to enable injustice. And sometimes, just your voice may be enough to give someone else the courage to raise theirs. Loudspeaker, what do you think? If you've ever witnessed, experienced, or stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing, share your story in the comments below. You never know. Your voice might be exactly what someone out there needs to hear right now. Bell, and if you believe in the power of stories, like we do, hit subscribe, share this video. And let's build a community where kindness is never silenced again. Because this flight isn't over. And the fight for respect always needs more people willing to take their seat. Are you ready?